This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to Getting Started with Enterprise Sandbox. We're going to be covering four main topics. First, we want to define exactly what Enterprise Sandbox is. Then, we'll describe the steps you'll need to take in order to make sure that it is enabled for your OneLogin account. Next, we'll cover how to create a clone of your environment so you can work with it within your Enterprise Sandbox. And lastly, we'll take a look at a few examples of how you might use the Enterprise Sandbox. So let's first make sure we clarify what Enterprise Sandbox is. An Enterprise Sandbox gives you the ability to create a copy of what is in your production OneLogin account. Thus, you can have objects like users, security policies, mappings, etc. that match your production account to work with when you want to test out new features or change settings. Gives you the ability to safely test new functionality before you roll it out into your production environment. It is also, as you may already know, an add-on to your OneLogin subscription. What it is not the same as a previous feature we called Developer Sandbox. The key difference is that a Developer Sandbox was simply a blank OneLogin account that had the same features enabled as your production account. It did not have a copy of the objects that you have in production. Therefore, in order to test, you would have to create relative artifacts manually, such as users, mappings, roles, etc. So the big difference you get is all these objects are part of your Enterprise Sandbox, because again, it is a clone of your production environment. So the key difference is the sandbox is a clone. Once your account is enabled for Enterprise Sandbox, you can clone it at any time. All your apps, branding settings, connectors, users, etc. will be copied into a separate OneLogin account with its own URL. So you can see here, a prestigious law firm, OneLogin, has an Enterprise Sandbox that can be accessed through OneLogin-sandbox OneLogin.com. Once you have cloned your production environment to your Enterprise Sandbox, you can now log into it using your production credentials. First, you need to make sure the user accounts you're logging in with are enabled. By default, only the account owner is enabled when a clone is created. Then, you can log in and perhaps create new mappings and test them out, or enable new features, or even configure other functionality like radius or TIDP that you haven't configured yet for your production. You could even do performance testing if you wish, since the Enterprise Sandbox has the same number of objects as your production environment. Be aware, however, not all objects are cloned from your production account to your Enterprise Sandbox. Most are omitted for privacy or security reasons like certificates and MFA devices. Some are omitted because it's just more efficient not to include them in the sandbox since they're not likely to be part of any testing scenarios like secure notes or personal apps. A few like VLDAP, Radius, and our new privileges model will be added to future versions of the Enterprise Sandbox feature. So, how can you get your Enterprise Sandbox set up? All you need to do is follow 3 steps. First, make sure to purchase it through your account executive or account manager. I'm afraid that's a necessary step. Then, decide on the URL you want to use for your sandbox. This is the one that you'll be connecting to in order to do all your testing. The URLs usually have your company name in them, maybe The word sandbox or test or even dev might be tagged in there. It really just needs to be unique. Once you know that URL you want, you give it to your account executive or your account manager so they can get your sandbox all set up for you. As soon as they've confirmed that it's been enabled for you, you can go to the settings menu and click on sandboxes to see it. This is an example of what you should see under sandboxes. So let's take a look at how we can go and create our sandbox. So to find my sandbox, I'm here in a production account, Training US, and I'm simply going to go to my settings. I'll see sandboxes underneath here. And if the sandbox has been enabled for my account, I'll see the sandbox. Might have more than one, but I'll see at least one sandbox here. And I can click on it to then go see, what's its friendly name, what's the URL for it, etc. And this is where I can start going and assuming access to it. But first, we need to create a clone. Now that we've confirmed that the sandbox is set up, we can create our first clone. Cloning is incredibly simple. All you have to do is select the new sandbox that was created and click on the Clone Now button in the upper right. Depending upon how many objects you have in your production environment, this might take several hours. You can click on the History tab to the left to see the progress of your clone. So let's go create a clone. So create my clone. I'm going to navigate to my sandbox. Select the sandbox I want to create the clone for. And guess what? Easy peasy. Click on Clone Now. Sure. Okay. So depending upon the size of your account, numbers of users, mappings, general objects, etc., that will determine how long it will take to create the clone. You can go to the History tab over here to see that clone that I just requested. It's still in progress. We can see this particular sandbox did have a previous clone that was created in April 2021, and we just need to wait a while, kind of refresh on it to wait until it's completed. And again, my production account, not quite that big, so it took less than a minute or so to create this clone, and I'm all done. Now that the clone is created, we can start working in our Enterprise Sandbox. In order to initially get into your Enterprise Sandbox, you can click the Assume Account Owner button in the upper right-hand corner. This method is absolutely necessary if your account owner has a user policy that requires MFA, since MFA registrations are not cloned. Thus, if MFA is normally required, you would have to use Assume Account Owner to get in and change the policy assigned to the account owner to one that doesn't require MFA. Once you have changed it so that an account owner can log in without MFA, or if MFA wasn't enabled by default, you can log directly in. Browse to the domain name URL you set up for your Enterprise Sandbox and use the same credentials you would use in your production environment. Accessing your sandbox this way may be necessary because there are some tasks you cannot perform when you simply assume access as the account owner, such as creating API credentials. Keep in mind, all users except the account owner are disabled by default in the sandbox. So if you want other users to log into the sandbox, you'll have to manually enable them first. And again, remember that users' registered MFA devices are not part of what is cloned for security reasons. Therefore, if a user policy requires MFA and is set to not prompt users to register their MFA during login, they will not be able to log into the sandbox environment. Your options are to change the policy settings in the sandbox environment or create a new policy that gives them the option to enable MFA when they log in and assign that policy to them. You can create this policy in your sandbox environment or create it in your production environment so it is always part of what is cloned. So now let's actually log into our Enterprise Sandbox. So now that I know that I've created at least my first clone, thus my sandbox is now populated with stuff from my production, I can go get into it. Now, by default, the only way that I can get into it initially is by clicking on the Assume Account Owner button here from the sandbox itself. So see, I'm in the portal and I can go over here to the admin UI. Now, at this point, I could start making whatever changes it is that I want to test out, but I also might want to actually be logging into the sandbox portal itself. So in order to do that, my users need to be activated. By default, they are not, including that account owner. So here's that training admin account that I'm using, and notice by default, it's inactive. So in order for training admin to log directly in and not do that assume account owner thing, I have to make sure that it's active. And again, there are actually some things you can't do when you've done the assume account owner. So easy enough, come in here, make it active. I will also want to make sure that whatever policy, in this case, it's the default policy, whatever user security policy that is applying to the accounts does not initially have MFA required for it. So I'm going to want to go over here to default policy, and I'm going to want to go to the MFA tab. And right now on the default policy, OTP is not required. If it was required, then at least make sure that they can register when they first log in. Because if OTP was required and I had something like do not prompt users to register their MFA when they log in, I wouldn't be able to log in because I did not get my MFA devices copied over as part of that cloning process. So if MFA is required, make sure they can still register when they first log in, or make sure that the user policy assigned to them does not require OTP, so that OTP auth required option is cleared. At least, again, to initially get them in, you can, of course, go through some of the same mechanisms that you did in your production account to get MFA set up with your users. So this user policy is fine the way it is. I don't have to make any changes to it. And again, I've set it up so that at least my training admin can log in because the account over here is active. So let's revert, actually, basically log out of that account. And now let's try to log in directly. And I'll actually just use a different browser for it. And I'm going to log in. Training.admin, OL. And voila. Don't save the password. I'm in. So again, initially have to do the assume account owner, but once you activate the accounts, once you make sure that the accounts do not require MFA, or at least will be prompted to register their MFA when they first log in, then you can directly log into the Sandbox account. So now let's take a look at a couple of common use cases for an Enterprise Sandbox. First one we'll check out is what happens if we want to maybe change some mappings. All right, so now we are in our Sandbox account and let's go see how we might use it. So one use case might be to create some new mappings and then test out those mappings. So in this case, I'm going to go create a new mapping, call it engineering group, And we'll say, let's look at their job title. And if the job title contains ENG, then assign them to engineering group that I have here. Okay, so simple enough. When I create these types of mappings, I can test to see, like, for a particular user like Barney Ruble, check to see, would that mapping be applied to him? But I've got multiple mappings here. In this case, in this particular account, I've got at least 8 that are enabled, and I don't know what the end effect will be. So when a mapping, for example, is modifying something like a group, a user can only belong to one group. And so depending upon the order that the mappings are firing off, and I can change the order, I might actually be changing Barney's record differently. So in this case, let's go see what Barney's currently assigned to. And here we have Mr. Barney Ruble. Now notice Barney happens to be part of the sales department, but his job title is engineering. This is also really why it's important that all my user fields be accurate and up to date, but we will use this for now. So if I go over to his authentication tab, I can see he's actually currently assigned to the APAC sales group, and thus to the user policy that's associated with APAC sales. So let's go back over to our mappings, and let's do a reapply all mappings. Right, so the new mapping that we created said if title includes ENG, like Barney's title is engineering manager, therefore assign them to this engineering group. So let's go back and see what happened to our friend Barney. Go to the authentication tab and notice he's been assigned to that engineering group. So what happens though, again, if I change the orders of these mappings? What if I move this guy up? Because notice I've got this other mapping over here, sales, and this is looking at the department field equals sales and setting his group to APAC sales. So again, this would apply to Barney as well, because his department happens to be sales, even though he's an engineering manager. And again, I've made this change to the mapping, at least the order of these mappings. So in order for the change to take place on Barney and everybody else, I'd have to do reapply all mappings. I could just test out Barney by changing him a little bit and reapplying it directly to him. In this case, we'll just do a general reapply all mappings. I don't have that many users, so it shouldn't take all that long. And let's go back over and look at Barney and see what happened. Right, so now if I go to the authentication tab, I can see that he's now in sales. Why? Well, because the sales mapping fired off after the engineering group mapping fired off. So it overrode whatever change the engineering group mapping did. So again, order makes a difference, number one, with mappings, but the fun of the sandbox here is I can make these changes. I can go and see how it affects my user in the end without, of course, making any drastic changes to that user over in production. None of this will affect Barney over in production. And what if we wanted to test some new features? All right, so let's try out something else that we might use our sandbox for. In this case, maybe we purchased smart factor authentication and we wanted to test out one of the features in smart factor authentication, which is the dynamic password blacklist. So we're going to go create a new policy here. There we go. And we will just call it password test. And we're going to go over to the password tab over here and put in some of the attributes that they might not be allowed to use. So first name, last name are good ones. We don't want their email and maybe the company name. Okay, so put in a few attributes, click Save. Now, in this case, since we're just testing this out, we might manually apply the policy to a user. In this case, I'm going to torture Mr. Barney Ruble again. And I'm going to go to his authentication tab, and I'm just going to choose that new policy that I created from the drop-down. Save it. Now, notice I have made Barney active already. Again, users that are cloned into the sandbox by default are all inactive. So when we want to test logging in as someone, we certainly will want to make them active. In this case, I can even reset his password to something that I know because I want to like log in as him and fully experience that login process for him. So I am going to set a password for him. And now let's go log in as him. So here I'm again connecting to training US Sandbox, OneLogin.com. We're logging in as Barney at OneLoginTrainMe.com. Click continue. Use the password I just created for him. All right, so we've logged in as him. So again, we want to test out what the user experience would be like to change their password, but maybe choose a password that they're really not allowed to use. So let's go to his profile and change password. So type in the current password. Make sure I got it correctly. There we go. It was very simple. And now we're going to type in a new password for him. So I'm going to put Barney 1234. Okay. So what happens? Let's try to update the password. All right. Contains insecure elements because it's on my blacklist. Right? If I wanted to do, Rubble 1234. And again, case insensitive, so I could do, lowercase r here, capital BL if we wanted to. Again, update the password, it's going to yell at me. So I need to set it to something that is not going to be yelling at it. So always adding in a couple exclamation points are kind of fun. And click update password. That was successful. All right, so now again, that's what I'm using the sandbox for in order to test out new features, new functionality, maybe making changes to settings. I want to see what the end effect will be. That is what an Enterprise Sandbox is for. So now you can go get started using your own Enterprise Sandbox.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.